There is an 11-year-old girl lying flat under a wooden bed. She does not move. She does not make a sound. She watches through the thin gap beneath it as the men who have just killed her parents move through the room. And in that moment, that single, world-ending moment, something fundamental shifts inside her mind. Not breaks. Shifts. Because what happens next is not the story of someone who lost everything and fell apart. It is the story of someone who lost everything and became something far more terrifying instead. That girl is O-Ren Ishii, and what her character reveals about the human mind is so psychologically unsettling because so much of it resembles patterns trauma researchers have described in real survivors of severe trauma, not because she is incomprehensible, but because so much about her can be understood. Here is the thing that most people watching Kill Bill completely miss. O-Ren Ishii is not frightening because she is incomprehensible. She is frightening because she is, to a disturbing degree, comprehensible. Step by step, her psychological development follows a logic that trauma researchers, grief researchers, and clinicians who study violence would immediately recognize. And when you understand that logic, you will never see her the same way again. In this video, we are going deep into the real psychology behind O-Ren Ishii, the science of what severe childhood trauma can do to a developing mind, what revenge actually accomplishes inside the brain, and why her final moments in that snow garden contain one of the most psychologically revealing character beats in modern cinema. So let's begin. The first thing you need to understand about O-Ren Ishii is not her skill, not her reputation, and not her body count. It is her identity. And not her biography, her identity, which is something far more psychologically complex. O-Ren is half Chinese, half Japanese, and an American Army brat. In the world Tarantino builds around her, and in the cultural context that world reflects, this is not a neutral biographical detail. It is a wound. Experiences of mixed cultural identity inside environments that treat ethnic purity as status can contribute to what some psychologists describe as identity fragmentation, the experience of belonging fully to no single group, of being caught between worlds that each reject part of you. The self struggles to anchor. It struggles to find a stable cultural home, and when that instability collides with catastrophic trauma, the psychological damage compounds in ways that are very difficult to overstate. We see the full consequence of this in one of Kill Bill's most extraordinary scenes. O-Ren presides over a meeting of the criminal bosses of Tokyo. A man named Boss Tanaka stands and challenges her authority, not on the basis of her capability or her track record, but on the basis of her blood. He questions whether someone he sees as insufficiently Japanese has any right to lead the Tokyo underworld. O-Ren does not raise her voice. She does not change her expression. She stands, walks slowly and deliberately down the full length of the conference table, draws her sword, and removes his head from his shoulders. Then, standing before the remaining bosses, she makes it absolutely clear that attacking either her Chinese or her American heritage will never happen in that room again. Most audiences watch that scene and register it as cold-blooded power. And it is. But there is something else happening underneath it that most people walk right past. Erik Erikson's work on identity development made the formation of a stable sense of self one of the central psychological tasks of adolescence. And when that process is disrupted by trauma, rejection, or the violent destruction of the people who were meant to anchor your place in the world, the developmental consequences can echo across an entire lifetime. O-Ren's identity was attacked at the deepest possible level, at a formative age, and in the most violent possible way. The Tanaka scene is not simply a power play. It is the behavior of someone who decided, somewhere on the road from a child hiding under a bed to the head of the Tokyo underworld, that she would never again allow the part of herself most vulnerable to attack to remain exposed to anyone. The decapitation is surgical. It is the final, definitive silencing of a particular kind of pain she has carried since childhood. And the message she sends to the remaining bosses in that room is not primarily about power. It is about the one thing she has never been able to afford: vulnerability. That is what the identity wound looks like when it has had years to harden into something else entirely. But here is where the psychology becomes truly uncomfortable, because the identity wound, as devastating as it is only the foundation. What is built on top of it is what should make every person watching this film stop and sit with it for a moment, because we need to talk about her stillness. If you have watched Kill Bill, you have noticed that O-Ren is almost never rattled. She moves through violence the way most people move through a routine morning: calm, precise, unhurried. When the crazy 88 fall around her and the bride tears through them methodically, O-Ren does not panic. She waits. When the final duel begins in the snow garden, one of cinema's most visually stunning fight sequences, she draws her sword with the composure of someone who has done this 10,000 times, and long ago learned how to stay perfectly controlled while doing it. Most viewers interpret this calmness as the defining characteristic of a character who simply does not feel. A killer who has emptied herself of human emotion in order to become a more effective weapon. But this interpretation is exactly, clinically backwards, and understanding why it is backwards is the key to understanding everything about her. What O-Ren displays resembles a pattern trauma researchers have documented extensively in survivors of severe trauma: emotional numbing and, in some cases, dissociative detachment. These are widely discussed in trauma literature and can appear in trauma-related conditions, including PTSD and, in the ICD-11 framework, complex PTSD. CPTSD is typically associated with prolonged or repeated trauma and includes not just classic PTSD symptoms, but broader disturbances in self-organization, difficulties with affect regulation, negative self-concept, and relationships. In plain English, the person does not stop being human. The system learns, often with terrifying efficiency, how to blunt or compartmentalize emotion in order to keep functioning. Judith Herman, whose landmark 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery, remains essential in trauma studies, helped bring lasting clinical attention to the way overwhelming trauma can produce presentations that look, from the outside, like coldness or emotional vacancy. But what can be happening underneath is not emptiness. It is adaptation. The nervous system has learned that certain emotional responses, grief, panic, visible fear, distress, are dangerous. They slow you down. They make you predictable. In the wrong environment, they get you killed. And so, with remarkable efficiency, the system learns to suppress them. Not permanently, not completely, but enough to survive. By the time O-Ren is 13 years old, roughly 2 years after watching her parents murdered in front of her, she has already completed the psychological calculus required to infiltrate Matsumoto's household and kill him. 2 years. She was 13 years old. And she did not hesitate. That is not the profile of someone born without empathy. That is the profile of a child whose survival required the temporary suspension of hesitation from her emotional repertoire, and who became so effective at that suspension that it eventually became part of the permanent architecture of her adult self. The frozen affect, the composure, the stillness, the eyes that give nothing away, is not evidence of what O-Ren Ishii lacks. It is evidence of what she survived. And that distinction is precisely what unsettles people when they study her carefully, because they recognize the pattern, not from fantasy, from the literature on trauma. Before we go further, if this kind of psychological excavation of Tarantino's most complex characters is exactly what brings you here, this is precisely what this channel is built to do. Subscribing right now takes 2 seconds, and it means you will never miss one of these breakdowns. Hit the button and let's keep going, because what comes next is where it gets genuinely complicated. Now let us talk about revenge. Because revenge is the engine of O-Ren Ishii's entire adult life, and what psychology has discovered about revenge over the last 2 decades is deeply counterintuitive, and it reframes her entire story in a way that most viewers never consider. Most people assume that revenge delivers relief, that the act of punishing the person who wronged you closes something that was left open, fills a wound that has been bleeding since the original harm. Researchers who have studied the psychology of revenge through controlled experimental designs, including the work of psychologist Kevin Carlsmith, whose studies on punishment, rumination, and effective forecasting remain influential, have consistently found the opposite. People dramatically overestimate how satisfying revenge will feel. The act of getting it typically does not close the emotional wound it was meant to heal. The pain predates the revenge, and the pain outlasts it. So the question that matters is this: why could O-Ren not stop? Why did killing Matsumoto at 13 not return her to the child she had been before that night? Why did she go from that act of justice into an entire life constructed around violence and power? The answer lies in meaning-making. Research associated with Robert Neimeyer and other grief scholars has repeatedly emphasized how central meaning reconstruction can be after devastating loss. When a person cannot build any coherent narrative around catastrophic suffering, when the loss feels arbitrary, pointless, and cosmically random, the damage can become even harder to metabolize. But when a person can force that pain into a framework of purpose, even a dark one, the mind finds a way to continue. For O-Ren, killing Matsumoto was not simply justice. It was the first and most essential chapter of an identity that could survive what had been done to her. The act of revenge gave her suffering a direction, a shape, a meaning. It told the fractured child still living somewhere inside her that what had happened was not simply the random cruelty of an indifferent universe. It was something that could be answered, and once that answer was given, the psychological framework it created became too structurally important to simply set aside. She had discovered that she was capable of what most people are not, that she could survive anything, that she could be the most dangerous person in any room, and a mind that has organized itself around that discovery does not voluntarily dismantle it, because dismantling it would mean returning to being the girl under the bed. And she had decided, very young, that she would never be that helpless again. This is not an excuse for what she becomes. It is an explanation of it. And that distinction matters enormously. Which brings us to the hardest part of this analysis, because everything we have covered, the identity fragmentation, the trauma adaptation, the meaning-making through revenge, generates genuine and legitimate empathy for O-Ren Ishii. And it should. But it does not change the reality that she is responsible for tremendous harm to people who had nothing to do with her original wound. She runs a criminal organization. She commands the Crazy 88. She is a killer operating in a context that goes far beyond a child's need for justice. One psychological framework that can illuminate part of this, though it should be applied cautiously here, is Paul Frick's work on callous unemotional traits, a body of research developed primarily around children and adolescents with severe conduct problems. These traits include reduced empathy, shallow emotional presentation, and an instrumental view of other people. That does not make O-Ren a neat clinical case. It does mean that some aspects of her presentation overlap with patterns psychology has studied. Frick's research, and later work around it, also makes something important clear. These traits are not simple cartoon villainy. Research has found links between childhood maltreatment and elevated callous unemotional traits, even if the causal pathways are complex and not the same for every individual. In other words, trauma does not automatically produce callousness, and callousness does not automatically emerge from trauma. But the association is real enough that it cannot be ignored. For O-Ren, the point is not diagnosis. The point is that the film depicts a person whose emotional insulation has become habitual, structural, and deeply functional. Albert Bandura, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, described a related process he called moral disengagement, the set of mechanisms by which people deactivate the internal standards that would normally restrain harmful behavior. For O-Ren, this does not seem like a switch she casually flips. It feels more like the operational baseline of a mind rebuilt for survival in an environment where softness was a liability. The armor and the person wearing it have fused together for so long that she can no longer clearly distinguish between them. And yet, and this is everything, she never fully shed the original self. The child who loved her parents completely and without reservation never fully disappeared. We know this because of what happens in the snow. After the final duel in the snow garden, when the bride delivers the fatal stroke and O-Ren Ishii is dying on the white ground, she does something that no portrait of pure callousness could fully contain. Before the last exchange, she has already apologized for mocking the bride's swordsmanship, and once she is dying, she recognizes the Hattori Hanzo sword for what it is, asks whether Hanzo made it for the bride, and understands exactly what that means. She acknowledges the skill of the woman who bested her. In that moment, the armor does not vanish, but it does crack. What comes through is not panic or denial. It is recognition. What that suggests, more cautiously and more honestly, is not some neat clinical category, but a brief collapse of the defensive structure that governed her adult life. When survival is no longer the operating concern, the armor loses its function. And when the armor falls away, what is underneath is not nothing. What is underneath is the person who existed before the armor was necessary. The child who understood, even early, the difference between right and wrong. She was never completely gone. She was just buried beneath years of survival, waiting for a moment when there was no longer any reason to keep hiding, even if that moment happened to be the last one. This is why O-Ren Ishii terrifies psychologists, not because she represents something alien and incomprehensible, but because she represents something that is neither. Because the arc from that child under the bed to the head of the Tokyo underworld follows a psychological logic that is chilling precisely because it is logic. Every adaptation was rational given what she was adapting to. Every wall she built was built because something real was trying to get through it. And the person who built those walls never stopped being human, even when being human became the most dangerous thing she could afford to be. That is what great filmmaking does at its best. It holds up a psychology you recognize, forces you to sit with it longer than is comfortable, and does not let you look away until you have understood something true. Tarantino built a character whose psychological architecture feels more rigorous than most fictional villains ever receive, and Lucy Liu brought her to life with a stillness and precision that communicates years of survival without ever needing to say it out loud. That is craft. That is the specific and extraordinary thing this channel exists to examine. If this video gave you a new way of seeing a character you thought you already understood, if the psychology beneath the cinema is what pulls you back here, then subscribe right now, because this is exactly what we do without exception, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Click the video on screen now. Let's go deeper.